So do you know Ezra as well? You good friends with Ezra as well?
I don't know Ezra personally.
Oh, my
Hey,
bad.
we're live. There we go.
There we go.
All right. Technical issues averted. Looks like we are going here. Well, hi, Internet. Nice to see you again. You are looking fine as always. Welcome back to Atheist Edge. My name is Chris. I will be your host, and we are joined today by William Albrecht. William is a Catholic apologist and speaker. We recently had the opportunity to see him debate friend of the show John Loftus here in North Texas about the virgin birth specifically, but we thought we would extend the invitation to have him on a show and talk more about Catholicism. We talk a lot about Protestants and evangelicals. But we haven't really had an opportunity to delve into Catholicism too much, so hopefully we'll get to that today. William, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Looking very much forward to talking about everything related to Catholicism in the show. Very, very excited.
Yeah, it should be good. Real quick, as we before we delve into this, you were when we were talking at the debate, you had mentioned that you were not always a Catholic. You had a little bit of a road getting there. So why don't you give a kind of the short version to our viewers of where you started out and how you wound up getting to where you're at now?
Definitely, yeah. I grew up in a non-believing household. We didn't attend church or anything of the sort. And, as I grew up, I eventually became an evangelical Protestant. Hopped from church to church. Really long story short, became an evangelical youth leader. Then when I became really interested in theology, I had a little short period there where I really just completely lost the faith, fell into atheism for a brief amount of time. Then I embraced and converted to Catholicism, and I've been Catholic for a bit of a time now. Quite some time, and now I defend and I debate everything related to the faith.
Well, excellent, excellent. Yeah, it sounds like uh,
It
let
was a
me
long road that I condensed.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we could probably do a lot with that. Well, let's get into it because I've been one thing I think I mentioned to you is that ideal. So my limited interaction with Catholics right now is mostly online on Reddit, which may not be necessarily the optimal forum for talking about some of the issues. And one thing that I haven't really been able to get a really solid answer that maybe you could help out with is the Catholic claim to be the authority worldwide when it comes to Christendom. I don't know. Growing up Protestant, we would
Yeah,
have taken issue with that, and
no doubt.
it would have been said that on the harder, on the maybe on the more hard or hardcore side, that there's some the devil has interfered with the church, and the Protestants have been able to get out from under that, or
Yeah.
on the less extreme side, they're just wrong. Um, but when I ask people that I'm talking with where the church gets its authority from, they'll usually point me to a particular passage in Matthew, and I feel like it's there might be more to it. What they're talking about specifically is in Matthew 16. Matthew,
You're correct.
yes, Matthew 16. This is after Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus says, "And I tell you, Peter, on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And that's 16, 17 through 19. So I think what I'm more familiar with, the Protestant interpretation of that would be, okay, yeah, I mean, Peter was without a doubt one of the main guys, if not the main guy, in the early church. He grew to a position of authority, but that there's a lot to go from there to the office of the papacy passed on in that tradition, infallibility. There's a whole lot that is not addressed by that passage. So can you kind of help fill in that gap a little bit to how you get from a leader of the church to the leader passed down through all time?
No doubt. And that is, for me, that is an excellent groundwork that you've laid right there. If anybody would like to, begin talking about the Pope, I always lead them right to where you went to directly. But there's much more the Bible says about Peter. And I prefer going to John chapter 21, where when Christ is talking to Peter and telling him that he is going to be in charge of his flock, he's going to feed the flock, he's going to take care of the flock. And he kind of, doesn't really demand, but he kind of wants an affirmation from Peter to confirm that Peter loves him and he is willing to be that leader. And then he uses a very special Greek word for Peter. When he uses it, it's called poimene. That is a word that is unique to meaning, and anybody watching can Google it. It in essence means that he is going to be the head shepherd. So not only in the sense of being in charge of the Christian group of people, but being the main one in charge in the absence of Christ. So that is one area. But then people will kind of say, well, you know what? That word is used in other areas as well. Give us an example of Peter actually doing something that shows he was this kind of prime leader. I would then point them to the book of Acts, where we have the Council of Jerusalem gathering, and we have much debate going on. And mind you, at this conciliar gathering, James the bishop, the brother of Christ, we don't know if he was stepbrother, cousin, or what have you, that was his church. He was in charge of that church. But Peter is the one that takes control to stand up and to, as the Greek word says, diakrino, to declare what they were arguing about. He stands up, declares that Gentiles would no longer need circumcision. The argument ends there. Then Paul and the rest of them stand up and they confirm the leadership teaching that Peter has given them. But as you know very well, that won't be enough for Protestants at times. So the thing that I think is very unique in Catholicism is we can point to those issues in the Bible. We can point to that, and we can, I believe, make a very concrete case for Peter being the Pope. But then there's another problem that in my mind arises. Well, where are we told that this chain of succession would continue? Mm-hmm. And that is where I would point people to Acts 1:20, I believe. I could be wrong. Where we are told that the office of the bishop must be perpetually fulfilled throughout time. And it is hearkening to a passage in the Old Testament in the Greek Septuagint. So we have that example as well. But for me, the better example is the living tradition of the faith. Once we leave the Bible and we look at the way the early church, so those that knew the apostles that walked and talked the earth with them, we look at their example. Was the office of the papacy continuous? Did it continue? And we know that it did, because we have the writings of a gentleman by the name of Clement of Rome, and we have an endless amount of writings that a lot of them don't exist in English, but you can find them in the Patrologia Graecae or in the Patrologia Latina. And we've got tons of writing that we can see, even though the church was not as we have it now, obviously not, the church existed. It had a hierarchy, even though it was on the run a lot, and the early Christians were basically being martyred left and right. The church had a hierarchy, and Peter was viewed as its head. I mean, even once we get to Pope Leo, when they read Leo's tome, the church, the East and the West, I believe that what the words that they say in closing is that Peter has spoken to Leo. So this was carried on all throughout early church history. So I would argue that Catholicism, even if an atheist were to say, you know what, I believe the Bible is bunk, I don't believe it. I believe they've been believing in fairy tales all along. That's a whole other discussion. But the fact of the matter is, we know the papacy has continued throughout time in an unbroken chain.
Okay. I know you mentioned this might not be the verse you were thinking of. I just kind of looked up Acts 1:20 real quick.
I might be wrong.
Yeah, it might be the wrong verse. It might be another verse in there. I just happen to notice that one specifically referring to Judas after he died in a gruesome fashion. It said,
I'm correct, though. That is it. Yeah, that is correct. Okay. Yeah, the office there is what is interesting is the office there, and it uses the Greek for bishopric, is hearkening to a passage in the Septuagint that shows a continuous fulfilling of that office. So look at what it says there. It says, let his homestead become desolate, and let there no one to live in it, and let another take the position of overseer, of bishop, literally. So that is a passage that the early church, if you look at the way it was interpreted from the very beginning, it was interpreted in the way that I'm basically telling you.
But so if this is talking about, I have the verse on the screen for our viewers. If
Sure.
this is talking about, um, I mean, it mentions Peter, but it's very clearly talking about Judas and replacing
No
him
doubt.
as well as one of the 12 disciples.
Correct.
My translation doesn't say anything about bishopric, or this could be the translation. But if it's talking about Judas, I guess I don't see the justification for having that then connect to Peter. Can you kind of
Sure thing.
on that?
No doubt. And I've given a few talks on this very issue, and fair enough, even Catholics have said, okay, we can grant it is talking about, replacing the office of Judas and what have you. But how do you make that connection? How do you then hop on over to Peter? The way we make that connection is in the fact that another is taking the position of bishop. So these individuals are not having their office remain vacant in the sense that the leader, he dies and the office remains vacant. The idea is hearkening to the book of Psalms, where one is in control of leadership. Once they have either vacated it or died or what have you, or been murdered, that office is then filled. And we know that Peter was definitely a bishop. We know that from all over the book of Acts. So that is where it's grabbed from. And then we look at the tradition at the way the earliest Christians interpreted it. And then we look at, in particular, Clement of Rome, who you might Google it. I might be wrong. He might be considered the third or the fourth pope. And the way Clement of Rome is talking in either the first century, 90-ish AD, or 100 AD, early second century, all of the language indicates that he viewed himself as supreme leader in the directives that he's giving to the Church of Corinth. So you got the Bible, then the Bible closes, and that ideology, that kind of theology continues on down the line.
Okay, so in other words,
does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think I was thinking, I know that the papacy is technically the Bishop of Rome.
That is
so
correct.
It's
Yes, it's
about
office of bishop.
passing down the office of the bishop. In the case of Judas, that would also apply to Peter as another bishop. Then okay.
Yes, that's correct.
A little bit. Okay. So when it gets to the issue of papal infallibility, and I want to be careful because it's not like, if I remember correctly, it's not like he's infallible all the time. There's a specific situation in which he's speaking ex cathedra. Do I have that term right?
You're 100% correct. Yeah.
So there's a specific situation in which he's considered fallible, and the rest of the time he's still an authority, but doesn't have that kind of weight to it. Where does that tradition come from? Because I'm not sure I know where that could be found in the Bible.
Okay, so I don't want to be wrong, so I want to pull it up. I believe the groundwork for that would be Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. I could be wrong, so I am trying to pull that up really quick. I'm trying to see. I'm actually wrong. It's 19. So 19 reads, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So the groundwork is already laid there, but then we need to understand, what are we talking about in terms of papal infallibility? So you're right, ex cathedra, but I guess a lot of people kind of misunderstand. Can the Pope lock himself in a room? Can the Pope actually, by the way, I've got a very good friend by the name of Elijah who's written an excellent article and done a show on this. The Pope, in essence, can't be a renegade by locking himself inside a room and not consulting with anyone and saying, you know what, I'm going to invent this out of the blue. That is not what papal infallibility is about. It's kind of like, it directly means that the Holy Spirit will protect the church. So in terms of faith and morals, because the Pope could say, you know what, I think, or the Pope could straight out say, the Chicago Cubs are the greatest baseball team of all time. And that would not fall under the ideology of faith and morals. He could be wrong. I wouldn't argue he is. That's my favorite team. But the example is, he could be very wrong, and he would be in that sense. But when declaring something and binding the whole church and using the language that you can find in the dogmatic decree 1854 on the Immaculate Conception, for instance, when he uses a language that says, we bind and we declare, and then he begins to give the language of something that must be believed and assented to by all the faithful, he will then give indication that he has dialogued and talked with the bishops all over the world. And they've come to this agreement based on what they would argue to be, and what I would agree to be, apostolic tradition. So a teaching like the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which, as you know very well, Protestants don't believe in that. Pope Pius IX hearkened because, as you also know, there are not a whole lot of infallible decrees. Mm-hmm. There are very few. So Pope Pius IX, when promulgating that, what did he do? He didn't say, well, the church has come to believe this now. No, he said this has been believed from the very beginning, from the apostles and on down to the early church fathers, early doctors, and we believe it now. And papal infallibility, we believe the Holy Spirit protects the church, and it prevents the church from falling into that kind of error that would cause the faith to really, be false, mm-hmm. to falling apart.
Okay, so, but we know that the Pope and his bishops, they're all human beings.
No doubt.
Human beings will disagree from time to time. In the history of church, there have been huge schisms and popes at the same time, and all kinds of messes.
Well, multiple claimants. Multiple claimants, yes.
But yeah, there's been all sorts of conflict within the church throughout the years. Not everyone's always necessarily agreeing on things. So could there be a situation where the Pope uses his office to make a infallible declaration that has not been agreed upon by the bishops and cardinals and so forth?
That is an incredible question. And for anybody wondering, maybe you've got a Catholic or a Protestant watching as well, anybody wondering, can the Pope perhaps go renegade and do that on his own? The answer is no. The Pope cannot do that. And that is precisely what Vatican I, which defined papal infallibility, it does tell us. If you look at the Relatio of Bishop Gosser, it does tell you that the Pope cannot do that. The Pope cannot basically go renegade and create something out of the blue. And even at that, even if you look at the infallible promulgations that do exist, I would argue that none of them are controversial. There are none of them that you can say, you know what? Why did you declare this, Pope? You've got so much controversy at a certain time that really goes against it. Even if you look at the Immaculate Conception, what was the controversy that existed in the time of Aquinas? It was really just in terms of Aquinas was wondering, well, when does the soul become present in the body and what have you? The argument was never whether or not Mary was completely free from every stain of sin when she came into existence. So I really don't, I know we've had, as you pointed out, there have been some pretty terrible popes throughout time, and there have been some, pretty bad claims. We've had some really bad popes in the chair of Peter, and we've had some really good claimants that are anti-popes that weren't popes that were, probably would have been better popes than the Pope at the time. Mm-hmm. But, we've never had any controversy, I guess, perhaps outside of the Council of Nicaea, which really, even that, the Orthodox bishops were pretty in line with showing that Christ was always believed to have been God. And I think if we look at the infallible decrees, the councils and what have you, I think they all fall in line clearly with what the Bible teaches. And I really don't see much controversy there.
Yeah, I feel like it would be hopefully a rare, given that he's talking ex cathedra so rarely, I imagine it would be it wouldn't be a situation that would come up very often, but it's interesting to kind of think about how that could happen. And by the way, thanks in the chat. I know apparently my audio is a little low, so I'm trying to.
I hear you clearly.
Yeah,
very clearly.
I think it's working in our streaming.
Oh,
but not
okay.
YouTube, there's something going on there. So
I got you.
I'll try and speak from the diaphragm a little bit like a professional presenter, and hopefully that will work. Or worst case, I'll say something dumb and no one will be able to hear it. That could work out to my advantage. Let's see. So Well, one thing I was interested about, and this may fall into what we were just talking about with the limited scope of infallibility,
Mhm.
but there have been some kind of, I guess, controversial popes throughout the
Mhm.
years. I might be blanking on names, but you have ones that were very much political, ones that came from rich families, and maybe were not necessarily have a lot of theological qualifications to be a pope. You had the one that dug up the body of his predecessor and put him on trial. There's
Yep.
interesting stuff going on there throughout the years, and they may be the exception. But
Yeah.
where does that lead to the trustworthiness of the office of the papacy if people can take the office and then have issues like that where they're very worldly people?
That is a fantastic question, one of the best you could have posed. Because really, the one thing that we need to realize about the papacy and about the Pope is the Pope is definitely a sinner. The Pope confesses his sins, quite often. So really, the one thing about the office of the papacy and the office of any of these individuals in the Bible is they recognize that they were very sinful individuals. They didn't think that they were without sin. Even when we call Pope any of the popes Holy Father, that isn't to mean that we believe he is holy without sin. That is to view him as his role as a father. He's shepherding his sheep, and we view him as he should be. Really, he should strive to be holy. He should strive to be, loyal and faithful to Christ. The problem is, as you point out, and it is a huge problem throughout history. We have had some pretty bad popes. As you pointed out, we've had some political ones. We've had I forget the name of the one that dug up somebody, put him on a chair just to condemn him. We've had some rough ones. So really, I think you posed a great question. How can we trust this office if we've had some really rotten seeds there before? I would answer that by saying, even pointing out to certain popes that were really bad. Pope Boniface wasn't really viewed as one of the greatest ever, and he gave us a doctrine that he gave us a teaching, no salvation outside the church. He really kind of hammered that out. We've never had a pope, even the political ones, that have attempted to promulgate something terrible and have succeeded. We've never had that. We've never had a pope, for instance, one of these political popes, or a pope that maybe even tried to buy the office of the papacy, that have, for instance, attempted to remove the words from the Word of God from the Bible, or to produce a heretical Bible, or to produce a doctrine that may say that Christ is not God, because doing that would indeed be promulgating heresy, and that would be against what we believe, that the gates of hell cannot prevail against the church. So we've never had that, ever. As many terrible popes as we've had, we've never had any that have gone and that have changed or attempted to change Catholic dogma.
So is it the kind of thing where hypothetically, like it, if something were to go down, where like if something big was changed in the church, that the next pope couldn't come in and correct that theoretically, or at least even things out bit in the long run?
That is a great question. I think, in terms of maybe theological opinions, that could be done. In terms of dogma, that has never been done. For instance, you will never have a pope come out and then tell the laity and the bishops there's no purgatory. That'll never happen. Yet we have had popes such as Benedict, or I believe John Paul II, that have said there's probably no limbo. And then we've had other popes before that have said, that have believed, it is a theological opinion, a theologumenon, that there is a limbo. So we have had that theological opinion vary throughout the history of the church, but it has never been dogmatized. The faithful have never been bound to believe that there is a limbo, or that, for instance, unbaptized babies go to limbo. Are there certain theologians that believe that? There are. So maybe we would have, let me give you a perfect example. Pope Francis, what was it, about a month ago, came out, and you can Google it right now. He said, Mary is not co-redemptrix. He had a ton of people up in arms.
Mm-hmm.
because John Paul II and a few previous popes, they spent a real good chunk of their time talking about Mary as co-redemptrix. And we've had a bunch of theologians. There's a big movement right now in the church of people trying to get this, in essence, made to be the fifth Marian dogma. It will never happen. So Francis came out and said, Pope Francis said, I don't believe Mary is co-redemptrix. Kind of putting it forth as, a little bit of a wacky idea for people that are really pushing for it. A bunch of people are up in arms. Maybe Pope Francis dies in about 5-10 years or less. Another pope comes out, and this pope may say Mary is definitely co-redemptrix. That could happen because that is not Catholic dogma. But in terms of dogma, you're not going to have a pope come out and say there's no hell, there's no heaven, there's no purgatory. That is not going to happen.
Yeah, didn't Francis also say something along the lines that atheists could theoretically get into heaven through, I forget what means he said, but that was definitely something that caught our attention.
I think through living a good life, I think he may have said that. And again, I don't know the whole context of that. I'm not sure if he meant that in the terms of invincible ignorance or not. I wish I knew the whole context. I'd really have to look into what he said. One thing that I can tell you, I may not be the hugest fan of Pope Francis, but a lot of the stuff that is reported in the media about him is not true. Like, one of the things we hear a lot is Pope Francis doesn't believe Christ is God, doesn't believe in the bodily resurrection and what have you. Yet when you read the stuff that he's published recently, he does affirm all those things. But then who is printing what I would call nonsense that he doesn't believe Christ is God? Well, it's somebody that is apparently near and dear to him, his personal interviewer. So we've got one of two things happening. Either one, his personal interview, which, by the way, you may know is an atheist. I don't know if you know that. A very good friend of his is an atheist. So one, maybe the guy is, stirring up controversy and lying. Or two, Pope Francis is telling him this in private, which I think is kind of, doubtful. But then you have that other aspect that even if the guy is reporting these things incorrectly, why does Pope Francis continue giving him interviews and being friends with him without clarifying that the guy is spreading misinformation? So, you have a bunch of those, things that we view as issues today.
Yes, it could be. We know the media likes to find interesting stories, whether or not they're actually the full picture. So it could be one of those things.
No doubt.
I know Pope says atheists get into heaven is a good way to drive traffic in a internet age. So it could be one of those things. But I feel like, not that I've super plugged into what's the latest and greatest news in the Catholic world, but I feel like I've seen more about Francis in the media saying stuff like that is a little bit more not as hardcore doctrine than maybe in the past. Is that something that you see from the inside also, or what's your view?
I do, and I don't know if it falls in line with the fact that really Pope Francis is not a theologian in the sense that Pope Benedict was, or in the sense that Pope John Paul II were. So he really does approach a lot of the things in a very spiritual manner. He's very open to dialoguing with many different groups of religions, people, and what have you, which really there's nothing wrong with that. In the past, people were really upset with the idea of dialoguing with homosexuals or atheists, and really they shouldn't have been upset, because you really need to open your doors and your arms to all kinds of people within the Catholic faith. And to his credit, Francis has really done a really good job in terms of that kind of an outreach. But the kind of area where we kind of wish he would do a little bit better is kind of clarifying some of his statements that we would view as to be a bit ambiguous. Whereas I don't think he's espousing heresy. Some of his statements that are a little bit ambiguous, I think he could do a little bit better of a job in that regard. But I think he's doing a very good job in terms of reaching out and attempting to evangelize those that really do need to hear about the faith.
Okay. Let's switch topics a little bit. One of the things that was when we saw your debate with John Loftus, a couple of the issues came down to stuff that probably has to do with the role of tradition in the Catholic Church. I know. I'm a little confused as to how that differs exactly from the Protestant view. I know even in a Protestant church, people will refer to writings of early church fathers. There's certainly a lot of quoting of Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and so on and so forth going on. So it's not like at least the churches I'm familiar with are ignorant of the early church. But it seems like there's kind of it's taken to a next level in Catholicism, and I wasn't sure if you could kind of go into a little bit about how that differs and how that plays a role in addition to Scripture itself.
No doubt, and I would argue the reason we hearken to the early church fathers more is because they're ours. They were Catholic. If you look at guys like Ignatius of Antioch, what Ignatius of Antioch is talking about, what church to go to worship. He says the name of that church is called the Catholic Church. In his letter to the Smyrnaeans, we've got Polycarp saying the same thing. So from the earliest era, the early church fathers didn't just identify the name of the church what they worshiped in as a Catholic Church. What they believed was uniquely Catholic, was Catholic doctrine. So I think that you've got Protestants that can hearken to guys like Augustine, Aquinas, and what have you, but they were not. Augustine was not a Protestant. Aquinas, was very Catholic. So I think a Catholic harkens to them a whole lot more because these guys were priests and they were bishops and they taught and they believed things that were uniquely Catholic. Let me give you an example. Ignatius of Antioch believed that the Eucharist became the actual body and blood of Christ. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a Calvinist believing that. They believe it in a very spiritual manner. As you know, I think you said you were evangelical at one time.
Yeah, it's kind of like
right?
a non-denominational Protestant.
Okay, I got you. Well, I was a Baptist and Methodist for a short period of time, and either way, both of those faith traditions don't believe that. So my point is, we hearken to these guys because they were very Catholic in their beliefs and their theology, and I think that I pointed something out to John, and I believe to you as well. And John agreed with me. John said, you're correct. If John were to debate an individual and that person were to hearken to Ignatius of Antioch, maybe an atheist that is not as learned as John would let it go. But as John pointed out to me, the person being a Protestant can hearken to Ignatius of Antioch. John, being the well-learned and well-rounded atheist debater that he is, will completely roast that guy because this guy is hearkening to somebody in the early church for support, yet he doesn't believe a huge amount of other stuff that early church father does believe. So I personally believe that when using tradition and using the early church fathers, I think the Catholic has a great advantage over the evangelical.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, and I won't put myself as an expert on early church writings at all. But from what I've observed, that there are people like to quote the church fathers on some things and will conveniently ignore some of the other things that they say. There's probably a better example that I'll think of later, but I think of Papias, who people like to bring up when it comes to the four Gospels and why we use the four that we have and not the other ones. So they use him to support that, but they don't really quote the passage where he talks about Judas and having his head blow up so big he couldn't walk through a doorway and he pees maggots and whole other grotesque things. So there's a little bit of picking and choosing there, and I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure if the ones that are Catholics use more often than not, if there's a similar problem there. But is there a way for determining, are there certain writers that are taken more or less wholesale, their entire body of work, or is there a similar issue?
Well, even the comments of Papias, we don't know exactly every detail of Judas' death. We don't. But you do bring up a very good point there. What if we encounter a church father, maybe saying something that really we aren't certain about? A lot of church fathers did. A lot of them had traditions, which we would call tiny t, that they didn't view as divine traditions. That, for instance, on Judas would be one. And I would argue, I might be incorrect here. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't recall Papias naming all four Gospels. Does he do that? I might be wrong. I'm sorry for not having that on hand. So even at that, you've got to look. I thought Irenaeus was the first one to name them all. I could be wrong on that issue. But my point is this: Ignatius even makes a comment saying, "This is a tradition that I hold to, but the church doesn't hold to this at large. So I'm not really certain on this issue." So certain little things can be believed. Maybe they believe this, maybe they believe that, which I pointed out to you. It is perfectly admissible to have a theological opinion such as limbo. But then on the flip side, there are teachings like the deity of Christ, which they would have definitely believed in a dogmatic sense, in a binding sense. Maybe they wouldn't have used the term dogma, but in a binding sense. And another thing that they definitely believed in, and they believed in it in the sense of it dogmatically, was the bodily resurrection of Christ. The fact that they believe Christ died and rose in the body, regardless of whether an atheist may think it's outlandish or whatever. That is the argument that I made to Dan Barker when I was debating him. Even if you don't believe it happened, they believed in the bodily resurrection. And that's something that I think even John would admit that, even though he would probably not believe it really happened.
Mm-hmm. So when someone like Ignatius says, "Hey, I believe this personally, but the church believes something different," is the ultimate source of determining the official church tradition? Is that up to like democracy where majority wins, or is there some sort of way to narrow down what traditions are accepted and which ones are considered heresies?
Incredible question, and I think it comes down to at 382 when they gathered to talk about the canon of Scripture. They gathered and they didn't stop and say, "We are canonizing this. We're making these books biblical." What they did is they sat down and they said, "Okay, which of the books that were used and viewed as the Bible from the apostles?" So it has to be apostolic. That is the argument. That is the whole point. Let me give you another example. We have Basil the Great from the 4th century, who he, in a tiny t, said, "I've got to face a certain direction when I pray." But then he'll say that this is not something the church is bound to. Mm-hmm. But then on the flip side, he will say this: the church is bound to believe that Mary was a perpetual virgin. So we have to distinguish between tradition in the sense of, as Paul calls in 2 Thessalonians 2:15, divine paradosis. The Greek word used there is paradosis, and a tiny t, traditions such as, I believe I should be facing this direction. I believe I should make the cross like this, or things like that, because there are traditions that they held to very strongly at that, but that they knew that they were not dogmatic.
Interesting. We actually had a question come in from the live chat, and by the way, people in the chat, feel free to drop some questions in there, and we'll hopefully try and get in there. This user John asked, "William, have you heard of the Colburn Bible?" And he wanted to get your thoughts about it. I'm not sure. I don't know what that is personally. I don't know if that's something that it falls into the Catholic Church in some way. But
I have not heard of it. Can he talk a little bit more about it? I'll do a little bit of research, and maybe is it an old Bible? I've never heard of an old manuscript by that name. I could be very wrong on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it either. John, if you want to drop more information in the chat, we might try and get to that a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, as far as early manuscripts, I've studied a lot of them. I've never heard of that. It might be medieval period. I might be wrong. I don't know.
Okay, well, let's keep going in the meantime. So we just did a whole debate on the virgin birth and issues subscribing to that. One of the things, and there's probably a couple things we could talk about with that, but one of the things that you brought up was the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is it's not in the canon of the Bible. I'm not sure if it was ever really considered for the canon of the Bible, but to my understanding, it was written about 150 AD, something like that, and it was written by someone who was not James. It was one of those pseudo-epigraphs.
Correct.
And then this was being used, and you had brought this up in debate as a support for the perpetual virginity of Mary, and as saying, hey, we have a document that's saying this was
well, maybe not for the perpetual virginity, but for the virgin birth.
okay.
Yeah,
But
but you can use it for that too.
okay, but it was brought up
Yeah,
as confirming that, hey, it's not just the gospel saying this. We have
yeah,
this other source saying that, hey, they
correct.
actually checked this out. The leaders confirmed that it was real.
Yeah,
But I was wondering, kind of related to what we're talking about with tradition, where you have all these different people saying different things. We have a book that was apparently not considered reliable enough to go into the actual Bible itself, but it's still being used as a source of truth. I'm just, it seems kind of weird to me that a book that was written 150 years later by someone who we know is not the person who's named on it, how that can be considered the authoritative source of anything.
very, very good question. And the reason the book is not biblical is because it doesn't fall under those categories of having that ancient orthodoxy to it. It was definitely not written by anyone within the inner circle. But as Megan Nutzman points out, the theology within there is preserving ancient traditions that were believed. So look, we've got what really we can really call it an apocryphal work. What do we mean by apocryphal? We mean that James didn't really write it. Why did they attach his name? Usually that was done to works to try and give them, more weight. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of the times, excuse me, a lot of the times the people knew that James wasn't even the author. That would go for the wisdom of Solomon in the Bible, which was probably written from the point of view of Solomon. This is the exact same case for this work, but this work is not divinely inspired. Now, you might be wondering, well, why did you hearken to it if it is not divinely inspired? In fact, we've had popes that have said this is an apocryphal work. And John pointed that out in an article he wrote. The reason we hearken to it is because it contains what is believed to have been very ancient traditions of the church. And we don't only have to take the word of that work, because a lot of early church fathers used that word, but they didn't use it in the sense of saying this is a biblical and canonical work. They used it in the sense of pointing out there are truths in this work that hearken to early traditions, early beliefs in the early church. And I mentioned something, I don't know if you recall. I showed how this work was hearkened to by the Catechetical School of Alexandria. Now, what was that? That we believe was founded by St. Mark. So we have individuals like Origen who hearkened to the work, believed that that teaching that I mentioned was true. And then we've got a titan by the name of Clement of Alexandria. More names are failing me, but there were plenty. I made a list of a bunch of names in case John would contest that. So the reason I hearkened to that work was because this falls in line with early beliefs, early traditions that showed one thing. Joseph wasn't just a fool that just took it. He just had a vision, believed it immediately. He had problems with it. And the early temple priests had problems with it, and the midwife had issues with it. That is why I hearkened to that document. And I would hearken to it anytime. I've given a number of talks. And by the way, a gentleman who is probably the top Mariologist in the world, he does also argue that there are ancient Jewish traditions that are preserved in that document that predate the date of 150.
But isn't there a difference between saying this is what people believed from an early date versus this is what actually happened? Because from the very beginning of the early church, there were a lot of texts written with all kinds of crazy out there beliefs that have since fallen by the wayside of orthodoxy. And there's a lot of early, and I think you would agree, early and incorrect beliefs about who Jesus was. The whole
Yes.
question of was he fully man, fully God? Where's the Holy
Mm-hmm.
Spirit fit into all this? That wasn't settled for 3 centuries. So isn't it a little bit different to say this is an early tradition and say this is a tradition that we should be following?
Well, I would argue that the issue of who Christ was and the Holy Spirit and what have you, I would argue that that was settled in the Bible clearly. I would also argue that controversies didn't arrive until maybe the early 300s. Well, but that's a conversation we can bring up at another time. You're bringing up a good point. Yes, there are traditions, there are documents out there that are floating that have incorrect things. How can we trust what is written here? So there is definitely not every detail within that document that we would say this must be believed as a divine tradition. Everything in here is correct. But the reason we can trust certain things from that document is because we do have certain stalwarts of the faith, early fathers, that do say this is part of an ancient tradition. So whereas they don't argue everything in here is correct, they do say that this does have early ancient testimony. Another thing that I pointed out is we've got guys like Ambrose, Jerome, I forgot what other names that I brought up, that point out a tradition that was very prevalent in the early church. You don't find in the Bible because you really don't hear a whole lot about St. Joseph in the Bible. And that tradition was the fact that Joseph seemed to have been very scandalized and very bothered at first, didn't really believe it at first, despite following the angel's orders. So we do have that little gap of, okay, well, what happened with St. Joseph? Did he have any issue, or was he, did he just believe it based on the vision in a dream? Because as you know, John really does paint St. Joseph in the light of what kind of a guy is going to believe something just from a dream? So we do have that tradition as well, that very early testimony tells us that he was scandalized. And whereas these documents, we need to remember one thing also. These aren't Gnostic documents. These aren't documents that are espousing horrific heresies. That would be something else if we had guys like Jerome, Augustine, not Augustine. If we had guys like Jerome, Ambrose, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen promoting teachings in them, we'd have a huge problem. But these aren't exactly heretical documents.
Are they not heretical because the church has simply decided that they are not heretical because they are the keepers of the orthodoxy?
Well, I would argue maybe they're not heretical because they're not like the works of Valentinian, for instance, that contain Gnostic works. For instance, there is a Gospel of Peter as well, where when Christ resurrects, he resurrects and he grows to the size of, a humongous kind of beast-like figure when he bodily resurrects. So you have really fantastical Gospels which have Gnostic teachings that would definitely be outside of the realm of orthodoxy. And then you have apocryphal works like the Gospel, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which don't have fantastical elements like that. And you also have writings like the Acts of Paul and Thecla. I'm pretty sure you've heard of them, where we clearly have a teaching of purgatory in there. So now, is that work biblical? No. But we also have apocryphal works where people appear in the work, and these people are canonized saints. But regardless of the fact that the work is considered apocryphal due to the fact that we don't know who wrote it, and the fact that it is not biblical, it is simply an example of early tradition, we can have truths within that without needing that to be canonical. But then we look at something on the other side that's being Gnostic or Docetist, which would teach that Christ is a phantom. And that we can definitely not hearken to that, because that just has all sorts of absurdities in it that really, one of them says a woman, in order to go into the kingdom of heaven, I think a woman must become almost man-like. There's a Gnostic work. So there's clearly differences in the kinds of writing. The person that wrote the Proto-Evangelium was probably definitely an Orthodox Christian.
I guess I don't want to be a snarky atheist here, but from the outside looking in, I mean, if we're going to say non-canonical texts are too fantastical, then what's really fantastical is a guy rising from the dead, or a woman who remains a virgin after birth. I mean, there's stuff that is accepted as orthodox that from the outside looking in seems almost as crazy as a giant resurrected Jesus, or a dragon, or whatever other things you have in these other books. And you could even say, hey, that there's still good stuff. You could say the same thing about, hey, there's still some good stuff in there. Love your neighbor as yourself. We can get behind that
Oh yeah.
without accepting some of the magical stuff. A very, very maybe a Jeffersonian way of looking at the Bible. But is there grounds for saying, oh, this is just too crazy, we can't include it?
Well, you brought up a fantastic point there, because really, at its core, the bodily resurrection of Christ is incredible, amazing. And from the outside looking in, as an atheist, and when I had my doubts as well, it seems wacky, maybe. How on earth is that possible? And I can really understand that you're thinking, William, you think these Gnostic writings are insane. I think the bodily resurrection is insane. I think the fact that you believe the Eucharist becomes the body and blood of Christ is insanity. So for me, I think the clear difference is this. We need to look at what is apostolic in terms of what we believe as Christians. Of course, I would approach it very differently if I'm dialoguing with an atheist individual. But if you look at it and you say, well, how can we stick to the parameters of Christianity? How can you tell me your version is better than the Gnostic version of Christianity? I would argue that the Gnostic version didn't have apostolicity. They weren't connected to the inner group. Excuse me. We know that because the writings, they come later. They come at a much later time. The resurrection accounts come at a much later time. They didn't have any connection to the inner circle. The inner circle were already in the Bible telling people that these individuals were definitely wrong and were definitely in heresy. But then you add another realm to it. You're like, well, the Catholics won the day at the end of the day. They got to write history. So how on earth, how do you know your version is right? I like to hearken to the enemies of the faith. If we look at what the enemies of the faith are saying at a very early period, we look at guys like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva knew of the correct form, the correct group of Christians, even though he didn't agree with their beliefs. He knew the group that were part of the group of Christ believed certain things that Catholicism believes, even the books of the Bible, by the way, that Catholics believe to be part of the Bible. He knew that early group believed they were canonical, which differs, by the way, from the Protestant Bible. So I think the enemies of the faith and the inner group, their ancient pedigree testify to Catholicism. And I would use similar kind of arguments when dialoguing with an atheist. I mean, really, we cannot show them any DNA evidence. We can't show them video of Christ resurrected. But I think the early testimony of Paul's letters, and then coupled with the early apostolic fathers, when they believed that Christ bodily rose from the dead. Because if you look at what Clement of Rome is writing, he's not writing anything insane other than the fact that he believes Christ came, died, was crucified on the cross, and he bodily rose from the dead. He's not adding any fantasy elements to it. If you look at the earliest writings, I think the evidence for the resurrection, the bodily resurrection, I think it is astounding.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things we are similar apologetics from the Protestant side also, and I personally have no problem with the idea that the apostles believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Like I'm not going to claim they're lying or they're trying to or they're scammers or anything like that. That's I don't think we need to go that far. I just think they were incorrect.
Right.
We know that there's such a
thing. Which is fair. It's a fair assessment. It really is a fair. Well, can I maybe ask you a quick question?
Can I by all means.
Ask you? Do you? I'm really curious what you believe, because I can tell by the way that you know your theology really well. Do you believe that maybe it was mass hysteria? What do you think it was? I'm curious to see what your thoughts are.
I know that mass hallucinations are not a very common thing. What is pretty common is just a single person having a vision of a dead loved one or someone they were close to. That's extremely common. So my kind of pet theory, and I can never prove this because we're trying to figure out what happened historically, but I think that maybe one or two of the disciples had a very common vision of Christ coming to them after his death, and they went and told the others, and the others believed what they were hearing because they had no reason to doubt them. They may have been desperate for any kind of hope in what had been a very unexpected situation where the Messiah had died. That wasn't supposed to be how everything went down. So they heard these stories and believed them, and they told others about them. And by the time the Gospels were written down, they had the story grew from one or two disciples having a vision of Jesus to all the disciples had a vision of Jesus, and he had a body, and he ate fish, and all the things that we get in the Gospels today.
Okay, can I maybe turn that around and maybe step a little bit outside of the Gospels?
Sure.
What do you then do with guys like Ignatius of Antioch, who tradition tells us knew the bodily risen Christ? And what do you do with guys like Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, who went to their martyrdom? Do you think that those writings are not real? Do you think that they just went to their death for a fraud? I really legitimately, because I know you have a good opinion in terms of, maybe this happened, even though I disagree with what you say in regards to the Bible. Well, what do you do with the Apostolic Fathers? Some of them that knew the apostles directly, that went to their martyrdom willingly.
I'm not as familiar with them. Did any of them have claim to have contact with the risen Christ? Or
Yeah.
is it all okay? Which ones can you kind of let me know? Maybe one or two of those, kind of what they're saying.
Polycarp of Smyrna, in his letter, I believe he only has one that is extant. He's talking about it. He's talking to the church, and he's then telling them, talking about when they saw the risen Christ, when they saw Christ, when he visited them before, and then he's chastising them for, in essence, losing the faith. And then we know Polycarp knew John. So they had connections to the inner circle, even if if you believe they were wrong or what have you. I kind of wonder why would they go to their martyrdom? We know Ignatius of Antioch died a horrible death, being torn to shreds by lions. I'm sure you know that story quite well. And we have later testimony of later fathers, confirming this. We have a martyrdom list where he does appear there. So I've heard the argument of the mythicists. I don't buy it. I'm sure you've heard of very well-renowned mythicist Ken Humphreys, who doesn't believe the early fathers existed, doesn't believe Christ existed.
Oh, yeah, I'm not a mythicist at all. But
yeah, no, I know you're not. No, I know you're not. So, but I'm just the only point that I'm trying to make. I think Ken Humphreys' position is really untenable. That being said, what do we do with those kind of figures? Do you think that they were deluded into believing this, and they also went to their death?
Well, we're talking about two different things here. I think there'd be a difference between
correct.
asking what happened to the apostles and what happened to people who knew the apostles.
It's definitely different. It's stepping outside of the Bible, and I'm just really curious what do you think about that? I mean, if you really would have to read it first, no problem. I'm just really curious what your opinion would be.
Right. From what I've read about this, I know there's been more work about this. I know the apologist Sean McDowell has a book that he kind of delved into the martyrdom tradition. I think he concluded that maybe only 4 or 5 of them were accurate. I have to read the book itself to see his reasoning for that. But
I've heard of it. I'd like to read that. I don't know where he would get that from.
It's always $50 on Amazon, so I don't have the money for it.
Oh,
but
is it available Kindle format?
If you want to donate to Atheist Edge, $50, so Chris can buy a Christian book on Amazon, then hey, we'll take it. But
donate so we can cover that.
But yeah, I know some of the traditions seem to come from spurious sources. If I remember correctly, Philip, his martyrdom tradition comes from another book where he also got in a fight with a dragon or something like that from Acts of Philip, I believe.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. There are a number of fathers we really don't know how they died. We really don't. Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I'm only arguing that we definitely know. Aside from any fantasy stories, we know that a very good number of them did definitely die. When we look at lists that, for instance, St. Jerome brought up, when he's not even really talking about how they die. In fact, I don't even remember. He does talk about how Ignatius dies, but there are a lot of them that we really don't even know how they died. Simply lists are being produced of early martyrs and them having been, killed for the faith.
And I think one thing that's interesting is we have modern examples of cults like Jim Jones and Heaven's Gate, where you have very similar situations. Heaven's Gate, I've been listening to a podcast on them recently, and they're very interesting for a couple reasons as analogous to early Christendom. One is that everyone knows the guy on camera with the big crazy eyes staring out at them, and he was the leader of them when they finally met their demise. But there were originally two leaders. They had been going since the 70s, and one of the original and the other leader died. And she was supposed to, and originally there was never supposed to be a mass suicide. They were all going to be assumed into some sort of alien next stage of evolution, something like that. And there was never supposed to be a mass suicide. But then the leader died when that wasn't supposed to happen. So what happened? Well, their theology completely changed. And it's interesting to kind of make the connection to early Christianity and how the apostles reacted. And the question that gets posed to us a lot is, well, how do you account for the change in the apostles if they didn't actually have a experience with the risen Christ? And my answer to that would be they reformed their theology. They found reasons to maintain hope, and in what should have been a tragedy that ended their circle completely, they found things to hang on
to. Would you argue maybe that that they reformed their theology, and we have that reformed theology already present in the Gospels? Is that what you would argue?
I don't know about present in the Gospels. I think,
or do you mean like later it got reformed, post-biblical era? What do you really mean by that?
Well, we know the apostles would have been familiar with the Old Testament, and we know that there is a tradition of Jesus being referenced in the Old Testament in various ways. And what's interesting from me looking in, and we can connect this with the debate also, is that when you actually take time to look at these prophecies about Jesus, they're completely out of context. Like at the debate you mentioned, I think Isaiah 7:14, and the virgin will give birth, and they shall call him Emmanuel. That's the only verse that anyone ever brings up as talking about Jesus. Everything before that and everything after that is specifically referencing someone who will be in that time of the specific kings that are mentioned and the conflict that narrative is set around. So, but
you mean a future Messiah? Is that what you mean? Because Christians would argue that the presence of Christ is all over the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord was viewed as Christ.
Right. I know they would argue that, and I just don't think they're correct to do so. They're picking and choosing verses, and it
Well, it does appear in that you would agree, though, even if you disagree with the theology, you would agree that in the New Testament they are identifying Christ with the angel of the Old Testament,
right? And
even though you may disagree,
right? And my contention would be, okay, getting back to what we're talking about, the apostles just had their world upended when Jesus died. So they're trying to figure out, okay, what happened? This wasn't supposed to happen. Are we?
But what about Paul, though, who didn't have to have his world upended, who really was not even a Christian to begin with, and he does hearken to Christ as having been an angel of the Lord.
Well, I mean, that's a little bit less set in stone. Well, we can get to that in a second. Just while I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking specifically of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew, because he's the one who brings in all of these prophecies. And
you would concede that he's not the only one that does talk about a virgin birth, though.
Right, he may not be. But what I'm saying is, setting aside the virgin birth for 1 second, but there's all other kinds of prophecies in Matthew and referenced by apologists. And what I think probably happened is, in the aftermath of Jesus' death, they're searching the Old Testament for clues, because they still think Jesus is the Messiah. They don't want to reject that because they've invested so much time into this, and I get it, but they're looking for anything they can hang their hat on as to figure, okay, what just happened? Why did the Messiah die? And they latch on to things like Isaiah 53 and things that they can say, hey, this verse that you think is about this thing, it's actually about the Messiah, and it shows that, hey, this death wasn't actually a problem for us. This was actually supposed to happen all along, and we just missed it, or something along those lines. To my mind, that's a lot more probable than having people reinterpret Bible verses to fit their new circumstances than someone coming back alive from the dead.
Well, you would agree at least, though, that they're not inventing a tradition of so-called reinterpreting verses. That was occurring all throughout the Old Testament already. If you look in the Septuagint edition, if you look at the Book of Wisdom, for instance, Wisdom is doing that very job already, and it's an Old Testament book of telling us that the serpent in Genesis was Satan. So I mean, that kind of issue of already doing that kind of doing divine interpreting was already a standard well before the New Testament. You'll at least agree to that.
It could be. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the Apocrypha, so I can't really speak to them. But you mentioned, if I remember correctly,
well, we definitely wouldn't call it Apocrypha. It's Catholic. Remember, you've got Catholics and Orthodox.
I don't know if there's a more proper term in Catholicism for the books. Deuterocanon. Thank you.
There we go. Deuterocanon.
The books of the Deuterocanon. I can't really speak for them because I'm not as familiar with them. But I do know that you mentioned, in reference to Isaiah 7, you mentioned there was a long-standing Jewish tradition that referred to that as the Messiah, and I'm totally cool with there being a long-standing, but
they don't believe it was fulfilled, of course.
Of course, but I'm totally fine with there being a long-standing and incorrect tradition of verses being taken out of context and referred to something they weren't meant to. I'm sure that the Bible has been, or the Old Testament and New Testament have been interpreted and reinterpreted and molded to fit agendas of various kinds since they were first put to paper, and I don't think that's that's
right. Which is, I would agree with you in that sense as well. But I would agree in a different way. I would say that heretical groups were distorting them and taking them out of context. So I would of course agree, but in a different manner. Mm-hmm. I definitely believe Matthew. I mean, in fact, Matthew, as you know, wasn't even the one that viewed that as referring to a virgin first. That was already the translation and interpretation of the Septuagint well before Matthew ever came along.
Yeah, it was interesting. You brought up, so every time we talk about the virgin birth, the issue of the translation of that word comes up as to the Hebrew version versus the Greek version. That's something I would have to probably look into a little bit further because you brought up some different points in that regard.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, we can look at that later. We can talk. We can do a whole show on that later.
Well, if we did a whole show on Greek, it would probably be a lot of me going, mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's not my strong point at all. Yeah. I know you're more familiar with those languages.
Right.
Let's talk about, since we're kind of getting back to the debate topics, let's talk about Mary a little bit. We actually had a question from the chat, a question from Jim, actually. Jim brings up the perpetual virginity of Mary. Jesus had brothers and sisters according to the Gospels. Do you think that those are things Joseph brought in from a previous marriage? If so, how old was Joseph?
Really, really good question, Jim. Is that Jim?
Jim Hall, our own Jim.
Awesome, Jim. Hope you're doing well. Jim, I think you know quite well. The ancient faith believed Mary was a perpetual virgin. You would be hard pressed to find anyone outside of the heretic Tertullian believing otherwise. So we've got the two largest, most massive ancient faiths, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, believe Mary was a perpetual virgin. The children, within Catholicism, you are fair to believe one of three things. Were the children really close to the family, simply called brothers and sisters because of that? You can believe that. Two, were they merely family members, such as cousins, because we know that those Greek words are used also for cousins? Or three, were they actual brothers and sisters, half brothers and sisters, children from Joseph. If you ask a Catholic, the majority will probably say they were cousins. If you ask me, I think they were probably stepbrothers and sisters. If you ask an Eastern Orthodox, they're going to say 100% they were children from Joseph, because that is a very ancient tradition, and some of the earliest Christians did indeed believe that.
I, is this is this even an important question in
I think it
terms
is.
of Mary? Because like if Mary had let's say Mary had additional biological children by Joseph after Jesus, does that really harm what Jesus came to Earth to do, or the story there? I guess what's wrong with saying that she did have more kids?
There would be nothing wrong with it if it was true. But the fact of the matter is, early Catholicism, early Christianity believed that Mary indeed had taken a vow, a perpetual vow of virginity. So remember, Mary didn't need to remain a virgin, because had she had sexual relations or had other children, it doesn't mean Mary would have become tainted or what have you. That is not the belief. But the belief is, from the very early eras of the church, that Mary did indeed make that perpetual vow. And as you know, it really didn't become, really controversy until a really later period. But if you look at what the early fathers say, if you look at what they talk about when they're talking about it, they all believed Mary was a perpetual virgin. If you look at the earliest preserved prayer to Mary, the Subtuum Praesidium from around the year 150 to 200, you've got early Christian group venerating, praying to Mary, asking for her intercession, and referring to her as an immaculate virgin, so a perpetual virgin. So as you quite well, she was viewed as a perpetual virgin from the very beginning, and I very, very strongly do believe she was. We see that in Proverbs, examples of women that were Jews that indeed did take those kind of vows. So it wasn't unusual for that time period.
So well, we're kind of setting the question back a second. So we're saying, oh, okay, she remained a virgin because she took a vow. Well, why'd she take a vow? She was married. What does that mean for Joseph in that situation? Was he just kind of sitting on his hands for the rest of his life, or?
Well, a good amount of people believe Joseph was they were married indeed, but a lot of people viewed him more as a caretaker than anything else, which is kind of why, and these aren't just my opinions, this is the opinion of the early church. As you know quite well, the Bible doesn't talk about him a whole lot. And then you delve into the early church and you don't hear about him a whole lot at all, really. You hear about Mary a ton, but you don't hear about St. Joseph a lot. The idea was St. Joseph may have been an aged man. I know that there are varying opinions. Some people believe he was quite young and that he took that vow of virginity as well. I kind of fall in line with the other position that I think he was aged. I do. And I do believe that by the time we come to St. Luke interviewing Mary, I believe that St. Joseph was already dead by that time. So I do believe that he was already up there in age, probably was married beforehand, had children from another marriage. I think that is probably the most likely, the likeliest scenario.
Cool. As far as the role of Mary in the church today, this is probably one of the things that, coming from a Protestant background, I have the hardest time trying to understand where Mary fits into things, because I was raised with the idea that Christ's death on the cross and our faith in that's enough. That is sufficient. There's no other extra steps necessary. But to my understanding of Catholic belief, Mary has a role to play. I don't know, is it like an intercessor? Can you kind of explain where Mary fits into that whole process and where that comes from?
Yeah, no doubt. That would come from St. Paul. Not only Paul, it would come from Luke as well. The idea of Mary being full of grace, the idea of Mary being without any stain of sin, that would come directly from the Bible. I would argue it comes directly from St. Paul in terms of Mary being without sin. In terms of Mary being full of grace, the Greek word tikaritomene, that comes directly from St. Luke. So in Catholicism, we view Mary as the most perfect creation ever done by God. She's a human being. We don't believe her to have any godlike attributes at all. We believe Mary was immaculate. She had no stain of original sin. She never committed any sin whatsoever. But Mary was human. Mary died. Mary, we believe, was assumed into heaven. But when we say assumed, we don't believe she ascended like a deity or anything like that. We believe Mary lived a very humble life. Very possible that Mary was illiterate. It does seem like St. Luke kind of, you know, tidied up that language there as he wrote it in the Greek. Mary was very likely an illiterate, very humble Jewish woman, but we believe she was immaculate. We believe she is a very, very important figure in the church because we believe God did incredibly great things for her. And remember what Luke says, what she says in her Magnificat, that all generations shall call her blessed. Ultimately, it comes back to Christ. From the Catholic point of view, Mary is called Mother of God. Why? The Greek word is Theotokos, Theotokos to anglicize it, which means God-bearer. Why is Mary important as Mother of God? Because she bore our incarnate God. Then we come to the title of Immaculate Conception. Why is that important? At the core, it is honoring Christ again, because Christ prevented Mary from ever being tainted with immaculate, with the stain of sin. This was not because Mary was a good person, because we believe it was done before she ever existed. It was done because of the graces of Christ. So every teaching on Mary redounds right back to the head, to Christ. So in essence, Christ is the head of everything that we believe in, and the beauties of Mary all point towards our Lord and Savior, Christ.
But isn't Christ a character that can stand on his own? I mean, the case is made that there's so much of the Bible, or the Bible its entirety points to Christ in and of itself, from the Old Testament onwards. Why then would there be another figure in the story necessary to point the way?
Yeah, really good question. And when you bring that up, I remember you kind of mentioned, why on earth do we look at Mary as kind of like another mediator? So one thing that we do need to point out is that everything does, in essence, point to Christ, no doubt. But it also points to Mary, because if you look right in the beginning of Genesis 3, there's a prophecy which is called the proto-evangelium, not the proto-evangelium of James, but what we would call the first gospel. Right there, we hear about the coming of the Messiah, right in Genesis 3. But we also hear about the mother of the Messiah, and we read that both of them will be at complete odds with Satan, with the serpent. So right away, we view in the very first prophecy of the Messiah, also a prophecy of the mother of the Messiah. So clearly the mother is very important as well. If the Bible believes, if the author believed it important enough to mention the mother, would be at complete war with Satan, with sin as well. So we do believe she's very important in that sense, but we don't believe Mary is a mediator like Christ. When the Bible talks about mediators, I believe it's 1 Timothy 2:5. I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It does talk about only one mediator between God and man. Context is very important. The Greek word being used there is the Greek word mesites, and it's talking about the fact that only Christ could have been a sacrificial mediator. It isn't talking about mediation in terms of prayer, because the book of James and several books of the Bible talk about asking your brethren to pray for you. And we have mediation in the book of Revelation, Revelation 5, where there's saints in heaven receiving prayers from people on the earth, and they're interceding by presenting those prayers to Christ as our God.
So does, I don't want to get too far down this stream maybe, but does God not hear our prayers himself and he needs people to bring them to him? Or is this like, if you pray to certain saints or to Mary, then you'll get bumped up to the line? I don't know how to describe it, because I mean, like, obviously there's no line. God can hear everyone at once and help
Correct.
everyone at once if he sees fit. So what's the extra step there for, I guess?
Very, very good question. And really, I think it all really comes around to the fact that when St. Paul is talking about the body of Christ, he's giving us imagery. He's saying that the whole body is connected. He's saying the head is Jesus Christ, but we are all connected. We are able to help one another. Our prayers are able to help guide one another. So the image that was set forth by Christ is that we should be praying for one another. We should be attempting to help one another here on earth as well, praying for each other here on earth as well. And then we get an incredible image in what I believe is either Hebrews 12:1 or Hebrews 11:1. My mind kind of escapes me. Well, we're told that the witnesses from the Old Testament who are they're dead, they're saints. We're told that they surround us like a great cloud of witnesses. The Greek word being used there is martyrs. They're dead. Mm-hmm. So they surround us and they're able to support us, they're able to guide us, and they're able to help us. We see that imagery come to a fulfillment in Revelation 5. So let me make it clear for everybody hearing, we don't need to ask for the intercession of a saint. We don't need to. We believe that it's very Christian, very Catholic, very ancient to want your brethren to pray for you, to pray that you receive more graces from the Lord, to help your prayers, to continue praying for you, to continue hoping that you do better in life, hoping maybe that you can overcome an addiction or whatever issue you may be having. But you don't need to. I don't need to sit down and pray to Saint John Paul II. I don't need to do it. I can pray directly to Christ. But we do believe that prayers to Mary, we do believe they are very efficacious, because having been the greatest person Christ ever created, we see her able to intercede in her earthly life right there in the wedding of Cana. So we believe even more so she should be able to intercede for us, being in heaven, being closer to her son than she was on earth after he left.
So do prayers to Mary or do prayers to a given saint, are those, let me see how to phrase this, because the issue, okay, prayer in general, from the, once again, from the outside looking in, we see people there's an ability to rationalize where you pray for healing or something, and a person gets well, and yay, God helped us, or they die, and well, God had another plan, and there's an ability to rationalize it either way, and there's not necessarily anything seemingly about the prayer itself that actually does anything in the process. So when you start bringing saints into the mix, and saints, having certain specialties where you have certain patron saints of certain aspects of life, do prayers to those saints or to Mary herself, do those get the desired results at a greater rate than prayers just thrown up to the heavens kind of willy-nilly?
Well, I think a prayer to Mary would be more efficacious than praying to St. James. I do, due to the very status of Mary. But we need to be a little bit realistic as well. If an individual's body is wrecked, totally wrecked with cancer, and they drop to their knees and they ask our Immaculate Blessed Mother, cleanse my body of this cancer that has overcome me, the likelihood of that happening is probably very unlikely, because we don't believe that answered prayer would merely be a prayer that has been answered, but rather a miracle. I don't believe every kind of answered prayer is a miracle. I think the amount of miracles that actually occur are probably very few. So there'll be distinctions to be made there. Another thing we would need to realize is, I'm praying to Mary, or I'm praying to St. Paul, or Mark, or St. Jude, St. Anthony. My prayer didn't get answered. I didn't get the job that I wanted. I didn't get the money I needed. I didn't get, my uncle, he didn't survive that car crash. What is going on? Does God not exist? The issue is this. We do believe God answers every single prayer. The problem is the answer isn't always yes. So we don't believe every single prayer is going to be granted in the affirmative. So, for instance, how likely is it that somebody is in a horrific car accident, they're on the verge of death, the prayer will help them? Very possible. It's also very likely the person will expire. We don't believe that God simply says, you weren't good enough for me to grant this prayer. He simply died because he was in a horrific car accident and the person expired. We don't believe God kills anyone or views the prayers of this person as being more valuable than the other. We do believe, though, that the prayers, the intercession of his mother does carry much more weight than any other saints would, due to the status of his mother in the Bible and as shown in early church history.
I mean, I wouldn't say that God kills anyone per se,
Right.
but
Lets
healing,
him die.
yeah, healing someone, like healing a child with leukemia, that would be nothing for him. He's not
Right.
like that wouldn't have to take a nap afterwards or anything because he used so much power on it. He could just will it to happen. It would happen, and I would think that that would be a pretty powerful testimony, and we'd probably say there are examples of this happening that are
No
used
doubt.
to confirm saints.
Uh,
Um,
I would agree there. And of course, but really, as you know quite well, the majority of the examples we have and the majority of the examples that we hear are of innocent children in poverty stricken countries dying horrendous deaths, or tsunamis wrecking certain areas and taking so many lives. Those are the majority of the things that I would argue capture the headlines of that we hear more than any of these kind of healings, which I believe are quite prevalent within and outside of the church as well.
just out of curiosity, I'm genuinely curious to know the answer to this because I know the
Sure.
Vatican, is not an enemy of scientists. They have scientists on staff, and
Not at
and
all.
they're
Yeah.
interested in aspect of things. Have there actually been any studies to say that wow, prayers to Mary had this rate of success versus general prayer versus a control group of no prayer at all? Has that ever actually been studied in any way?
That is a really excellent question. And in terms of percentage of prayers um, to Mary, no, that has never really been looked at. But one thing that is always studied and examined very, very carefully, or before any individual is canonized, they do very, very deep and meticulous research to see, has anyone been venerating this individual as a saint? Have they been asking for the prayers? Are there any miracles attributed to this individual that we can look at and we can say it is very, very likely that a miracle occurred here? So they do definitely do that, which is part of the reason why you look at somebody like St. John Paul II, who was canonized as a saint, and yet you have somebody like Blessed Duns Scotus, who I would argue is definitely a saint in my book. He was a champion of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, who really became quite an obscure figure. We don't know a whole lot about him. Not all of his works are translated into English. He kind of fell into obscurity. So, what is the likelihood of a miracle being attributed to Duns Scotus? Not very likely, because it's kind of more or less fallen off the radar. And the church would really have to hear, they'd have to get that call and have to hear, hey, there's a lot of miracles being attributed to Duns Scotus. There's a cult of Duns Scotus, not in the sense of a maniacal cult, but a group of following of people that attribute these miracles to them. They definitely do meticulous research on that.
Doesn't that kind of then raise the possibility that sainthood or canonization could be biased towards people who are popular already?
No doubt.
Because
Yep.
it said there could be some obscure person in a
You're right.
mountain diocese in Peru that no one's ever heard of doing fantastic stuff, but they're off the grid. Whereas as someone from Mother Teresa, one, we have more insight into her life than someone in a different parish, and two, people by nature they'll want to um, connect themselves with her and make all sorts of claims that, oh, she helped me find my keys last week or something like that, just to kind of elevate themselves by association with her. Do you think that is there a risk of that, or is their procedures robust enough that things like that could be weeded out?
Well, I think the procedure is very, very robust. I don't think that we're going to find a cult following or venerating an individual with miracles attributed to that person that really can't be given good veracity in terms of the miracles. I don't think that would occur, but I think the likelihood of finding somebody like a Cardinal John Henry Newman, by the way, who just got canonized, I think somebody along the lines of a Mother Teresa or a John Cardinal Henry Newman or John Paul II, even Saint John Paul II, are likelier to get canonized than maybe a Jose Rodriguez, who maybe has taken 300 individuals outside of the cartel from murdering and killing people and really just converted them to Christianity and changed the whole little town. By the way, that's not the name of a real person, but people they're attributing these kinds of things to areas in Mexico that are just completely converting to the faith, abandoning such horrible cartel violence. And the likelihood of that person being canonized later on in life, at this point, it's not very likely. I mean, even if I just told you the name of Duns Scotus, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but the likelihood of him getting canonized, not very likely. We'd probably have to get a pope that's a Franciscan that really cared enough to do it, to really say, okay, look, let us look into any miracles being attributed to him. The likelihood of that, not very likely, because it's kind of fallen off the radar. We don't hear a whole lot about him. Even if you Google him right now, you're probably going to, you Google Duns Scotus complete works, you're not going to find them in English. It's a tough scenario. So you bring up a good point there. Very good point.
Okay. Just so the viewers know, we're probably going to go for roughly half an hour longer on this. So if you have any questions about Catholicism that you're wanting to get out, by all means, throw them in the chat.
Any tough question, anything they want.
Yeah, so throw them in the chat. Jim will get them to me. I'm trying to pay attention to the chat, but it's spotty here or there, so Jim will get it to me if it's a good one.
Yeah, it can be a little bit hard sometimes.
Yeah, I am not a multitasker, but let's see. Let's talk about the sacraments a little bit, because this is another one of those things that I know Protestants, they will participate in communion and stuff like that, but that seems to play a much larger role in Catholicism and seems to be much more central to the actual salvation process. I'm especially curious about transubstantiation, because I know that's something that people from outside think is a just absolutely bizarre notion. So I wasn't sure if you could kind of go into that specifically. Is that something that comes directly from the Bible? Is that something that comes later? Where does that come from?
Definitely, and that is definitely biblical. So we would argue, a Catholic and an Eastern Orthodox would argue, that the idea that the fact that Christ's body and blood, body and blood become, actually, I'm saying it wrong. The idea that the bread and the wine become the actual body and blood of Christ is very biblical. So you might have Christ saying, take, eat this. This is my body. This is my blood. You might have the argument being made that could be symbolic, even though the language really is not indicative of anything symbolic. Once you get to John chapter 6, verse 46 all the way to verse 54, the language is so incredibly strong. The usage of the Greek word trogon, which literally, if you think of the Spanish tragar, literally means to gnaw and to chew. Christ is telling them that the bread and the wine become his actual body and blood. Of course, we don't mean Christ in front of them, they're going to begin feasting on them. We don't mean it in a cannibalistic manner. We mean it in a very real, in a very actual spiritual manner. So the spiritual is a tangible, not in the sense of us actually feasting on them, but in a very spiritual, in a very real manner. We do believe that to be real. And I would argue, I think anybody would be very hard-pressed to find any church father that didn't believe that. That was one of the central things of the faith. Ignatius of Antioch calls that one of the main things that he believed as well. So we've got it as early as Ignatius, we've got it in all of the early fathers. Even Martin Luther believed in that. So we even have that in Martin Luther. We don't have that kind of falling off the mat until really we get to the time of Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, when they really begin to put a spiritual kind of belief, the spiritual in the sense of not bodily kind of belief. And then we get to the modern day American Protestantism, which really has even abandoned the spiritual, and they believe it to be completely symbolic. They have, what I would argue, made a complete mockery of it. They give you grape juice and crackers whereas the early apostles and the early fathers would have never done that. There's a very big difference between ancient Christianity and modern day Protestantism, I would argue.
Yeah, I will say we may agree on that point, because I know my church, we used to do the whole crackers and grape juice kind of thing, and
Yeah, and even if you would disagree with it becoming the body and blood, you would at least admit the predominant early belief was that it really did become the body and blood.
that much I would have to look into. Like I said, I'm not as familiar with the work of the early church fathers to know what all the big names thought of that specifically.
Okay, gotcha.
But yeah,
Fair enough.
uh, I always wondered why they didn't do, like, at least do wine, right? Like if you give wine to someone in church in a little plastic
You
cup,
know,
it's not going to
give
hurt
them a little bit of
anything.
wine.
Yeah.
And really, that does come around to the issue that the massive majority of modern day Protestant churches have issues with alcohol. So, I mean, come on, Christ drank alcohol. All of the early fathers say, by the way, I've given talks just in the fact that the early church had no problem with alcohol in the sense of within the Eucharist and as well as enjoying a good glass of wine or even a good glass of what was considered beer back then. It was called strong drink. It would be what we would call beer to this day. They had no problem with that. I would argue that modern day Protestantism has given you that grape juice because they have such a big issue with alcohol.
Yeah, I think that might be more specific to American Protestantism, because I know even
Yes,
over in Europe, the culture there surrounding alcohol and beer is completely different.
very different.
And in, like you
Yeah.
said, in medieval Europe, people would drink beer, and even I think in the American colonies, people would be drinking beer or some sort of
Luther drank
maybe
quite a bit of beer.
well, he was German, so
Yes,
that goes to the line. So I suspect that's probably more of a American prohibition, teetotaling
no
adaptation
doubt.
specific to the modern church. Maybe if we had more wine in church, more people would be attending. But I'll let that to them to figure it out. But we got the Bible and Beer Consortium, so obviously people are coming around to bringing it in. But
No doubt.
so but back to the transubstantiation thing. Where do you, not to be too scientific about it, but I mean we know how digestion works roughly
Mhm.
from the beginning to the end. Where in that process does the Eucharist actually become Jesus' flesh? Like how does
Well,
that?
we believe as soon as the words "This is my body and this is my blood" are said by the priest is called an alter Christus, another Christ, not in the sense of he's an actual Christ, but in the sense that the priest opens himself up to saying the exact words of Christ. And we believe those words are what bring about the transubstantiation. To say transformation is a bit odd. And really, if you look at the papal decrees, when transubstantiation was defined, the church said this: the idea of Aristotelian concepts, the idea of the actual word transubstantiation, this is the best we can do to describe the fact that we believe there is an actual change happening in the elements despite our eyes not being able to see them. We believe an actual change is being undertaken, it's happening before our very eyes, even if we may not be able to see it happening. And I would argue that even though it is quite limited, Eucharistic miracles, I think those are mind blowing. How do we answer some of these Eucharistic miracles? I'm just totally blown away by those. I would love to do a show just on Eucharistic miracles. I've talked to so many individuals, and I think that is such a compelling topic. And I think that goes to the heart of transubstantiation.
Well, give us an example. I may not be able to do a whole ton of time on it, but
Yeah,
when you're talking about Eucharistic miracle, what are we talking about here?
I'm talking about miracles such as, and you can Google it, the miracle of Lanciano, Italy, where the host began to bleed. That miracle is preserved to this day. Then we have a miracle from Pope Gregory the Great, where legend tells us, because we don't know exactly what he was saying in the homily, but legend tells us that in the homily, a lady began to laugh at him and doubt the belief in transubstantiation in the belief that the bread and the wine become the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, that is a legend. The lady began to laugh at him. We don't know if that really happened, but what we do have written, cataloged, still to this day, is that the host began to actually bleed, and that host to this day, from Pope Gregory, is preserved in Germany at Ondex. And if you get a special dispensation, you can actually see the host with, on the wall right there, as soon as you walk into the church, a massive list of places that host has been throughout history. It's just astounding. It's just mind-blowing. And that is one thing that I can't wrap my mind around. Eucharistic miracles that really are quite ancient. I personally believe, and they're much more than that. Those are only two that come to mind right away. I believe that is in and of itself is incredible proof of the fact of the words of Christ in the Bible. When he says, "This is my body and blood," it becomes the actual body and blood of Christ. And I think it connects perfectly with what every single early church father would have believed in terms of the Eucharist.
So what is the understanding then of the purpose of communion, given that there's so much going on there in terms of transubstantiation? To a Catholic, what does that sacrament actually mean to them? Is it just a nice reminder of participating in the suffering of Christ in some way, or is there some actual power there being manifested in the ritual itself?
We believe that when the host becomes the body and blood of Christ, that we are able to actually worship God. That we are able. That is why we kneel and we worship. We say, "My Lord and my God" at Mass. So the Lord of me is the God of me, directly. That's what the Greek reads. We believe it actually becomes our Lord and our Savior. So, but that aside, we truly believe that even more graces are being bestowed upon us when we partake of it. So partaking of Mass, which we believe it to be an actual sacrifice, not a sacrifice in the sense of Christ is hung on the cross again, not that kind of a sacrifice. We believe it to be an actual sacrifice. The Greek is very evident of that. We believe that it is bestowing more graces upon us, and really, I think there's a lot of evidence of that in terms of what the early church said and in terms of what the Bible says. So that is why we believe it is essential to be partaking of the Eucharist.
So when you say it bestows more graces, plural, what does that mean exactly? I'm aware of grace as like a singular, broad term, but I didn't think of it as something that there could be a quantity of that you can want more of.
Yeah, well, another good example, some people have attributed the grace of healing to having partaken of the Eucharist. A number of people have said that they've felt incredible healing in terms of, I'm trying to remember a certain case. I'm trying to remember in Altaten in Germany, there were a number of people that said that they attributed, I don't remember what kind of injuries. Certain people had leg injuries where the people were partially paralyzed. They attributed their healing to the Eucharist. So we have a number of, now that could be true, or that could be, again, that could be fallacious. I haven't studied even one case from Altaten, Germany, but if you Google it, you will find an incredible quantities of individuals claiming healing and attributing that to the Eucharist. So I really haven't looked into that, but that is an example of something. We believe that the grace of healing and the grace of charity, the grace of love, is being bestowed upon us when we partake of the Eucharist, because we believe it to be the actual body and blood of Christ.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. I think we had another question coming in. Okay, another question from Jim. Jim was asking, do you think that Jesus had the current Catholic Church in mind when he commanded Peter to start the church? I know we kind of talked about a little earlier, but did he have a vision in mind of what the church would become, I guess, as when he was just kind of saying, "Hey, I'm going to build this on you as the rock"?
Well, That I think it's a really loaded question, and I'll answer that in two ways. Number one, I think that when he told Peter that, at that point he was bestowing the keys upon Peter. I really think the essence of the papacy appears in John 21, not Matthew 16. That's a bit of a misconception. A lot of people right away jump to Matthew 16,
Mm-hmm.
but staying right on that point, did he have what did he have in mind? Well, when he was telling Peter that, he definitely didn't have in mind the Vatican. He definitely didn't have in mind Rome or any of those things. At that particular point in time, would Christ have known what would have become of the papacy? No doubt. We believe him to have been Almighty God, omnipotent, omniscient, all the omnis, no doubt. But at that particular point in time, he would have known that Peter would have been the leader, as evinced in Acts chapter 15. And he would have known that Peter would have been the leader of a church that was on the run, living underground, that was going to be martyred. The majority of them were going to be killed. And he would have known that Peter was going to die, crucified upside down as well. But he would have definitely known what would have become of the church later in the future as well. I don't think he would have been happy at all the popes that we've had throughout history. But I think a good amount of them he would have been very proud of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kind of getting back to the sacraments a little bit, and this may be something that I have a misunderstanding of. Is there a view, because there's more than just communion, right? There's confession in there, there's the rosary, there's a lot more going on in there than the Protestant church. Is all those extra steps, those play a role in the salvation process specifically? Like if you don't do so many rosaries, you're going to spend more time in purgatory or something like that. How does that relate to salvation itself?
Well, one thing that we do need to clarify in terms of purgatory, what is purgatory? Really briefly, in a nutshell, because I know it's already 3:47. In a nutshell, purgatory is simply this: we believe that you must be completely clean to enter heaven. Nothing impure can enter heaven. So, in the afterlife, some people may need to undergo purification. The Greek word used for that is puros. Some people may need to undergo it. Paul gives that example in 1 Corinthians 3. People going through the fire, but eventually being saved. That is what purgatory is. It doesn't necessarily indicate that there's time. It's in the afterlife. We don't know if, the concept of time is the same as it would be here. Does it indicate that an individual must undergo suffering over a period of time? The church has never defined that. The church has never even said that purgatory is a place. Purgatory could be a state that you go through immediately, or it could be a place. What do I fall in line with? I think it's most likely a place. But the church has never dogmatically defined that. Back to the rosary. You don't have to say the rosary as part of the Catholic faith. Now that might sound, what are you saying? You're a Catholic apologist, theologian. What are you saying, William? The church never says you've got to say the rosary to go to heaven. You should say it, though. The rosary is very efficacious. You should say it, even if only as a sense of meditation and prayer to draw you closer to God and his mother. You should, but you don't have to say it. We believe in Catholicism, you're not saved by your good works. You're saved by grace alone, through faith and good works. So grace alone is a gift of God. That is the official teaching of the church. We don't believe that if you pick up a rosary and simply say it and not truly believe, we don't believe that you will, knock down those doors, rush St. Peter, rush past St. Peter into heaven.
So I recognize I may have accidentally opened a can of worms by mentioning purgatory, but I didn't really need to, because we could probably spend a lot of time on that specifically.
No doubt.
But as far as things like confession are concerned, I was under the impression that confession. I guess maybe since we did talk about purgatory, is confession going to be something that if you don't confess all your sins, if you don't actually go through that whole sit in the closet with the priest process, that you'll just wind up spending more time in purgatory and you'll still be good at the end of that? Or is there going to be a problem if you die with sins unconfessed?
There would be a problem if you died with mortal sins unconfessed. So what is a mortal sin? 1 John chapter 5 tells us that there are certain sins and that there are other sins that lead to death that are mortal. What does that mean? I will give you what I think to be a very good example. And even if you are not a believer, you're going to have to admit this is the most logical conclusion that a believer could come to. I'm going to give you an example of two different people. One person is on his deathbed, and that person has just accepted Christ, was a non-believer his whole life, just accepted Christ, but he was an incredible guy, did tons of charity work. The guy dies. Some sins. Maybe he'll go through purgatory, a little bit of purification. I would definitely believe he probably would. He accepted Christ, accepted God, accepted the truth. Then you've got another individual who is on his deathbed, and that individual has committed what I would call to have been a mortal sin. The individual lived his whole life as a believer, lost the faith maybe about a month before, and had murdered several individuals. Boom, gets hit by a car, is in the hospital, he dies. I do not believe that individual would go through any purification process. Having died with a mortal sin, having been a murderer or a rapist or a child molester or anything along those lines, the Catholic faith believes that he would most likely be damned.
So I think, man, we're getting to all the stuff that we could go on a long talk about at the very end.
Does it make any sense? Even if you think, you know what, this might be a little bit illogical. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
Okay.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Okay, look, you do know that purgatory, no matter what, anyone that goes to purgatory in Catholic teaching, they go to heaven. You know that.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure to bring that up, but so like someone like me.
So do you think
am I going to go to? I'm not a believer in any stretch, and I've never even been a Catholic. Am I just going to spend a very, very long time in purgatory and then go to heaven? Or
well, remember, we don't know if there's any aspect of time in the afterlife, and I mean, from now till the point that you die, we don't know if later on you will accept the faith or not. I mean, I imagine you're going to live a very long life, so anything could happen from here to then. But let me toss something hypothetical at you. Knowing that any individual that will go through purification are eventually going to be saved, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, you can be fine with that. With the example that I gave you, somebody may have been not such a good person, cleaned up their life and died without having truly confessed certain minor sins. You can imagine seeing that kind of a person in your vision of heaven. But can you imagine seeing somebody that ended their life as an unrepentant rapist, as an unrepentant murderer, as an unrepentant, kind of Charles Manson type of psycho guy? Would that guy, in your mindset, logically be in heaven?
Well, this is where we start getting into questions of soteriology, because I know there's varying views on that.
Which we did with purgatory. I mean, that is part of soteriology.
But yeah, I mean, if purgatory exists, then the only thing that should keep people out of heaven is if they don't go to purgatory at all. But if Christ on the cross accomplished what he's theoretically supposed to have accomplished, then you shouldn't need purification at all, I would think.
Why not,
because Christ, and this is why I say soteriology, because on a view of where either Jesus, I know this is my Protestant upbringing, but seeing that Jesus paid the price for us, or that Jesus paid the ransom for us, then
but when it says that, is it talking about, we got to be careful what the text is talking about. Is it talking about at that point when you accept Christ, the sins that you've committed in the past, or is it also talking about every single other sin? Because the text does say we must continue faithfully and we must continue confessing our sins. So clearly it's talking about our past sins. We can still be punished for our future sins, or else why else would St. Paul say you must persevere or you can lose the crown of your salvation?
But I mean, at the time of Jesus' death, I mean, here in the 21st century, all sins were in Jesus' future. So, I mean, he had the capability to pay the penalty for any sins that you or I may do, past,
and
present,
we still believe,
future. And then what else do we need to do at that point?
Well, because you can still sin and fall from the faith. And
but I can still sin and have Jesus have died for those sins already. So
Right, but there's still punishment for those because St. Paul says it. St. Paul gives you an imagery of an individual who continues sinning and tears down the foundation, talking about the foundation, his body. And that person that does continue sinning and tears down that foundation, which the foundation is Christ, excuse me, but the body is going to go through the fire, that person, St. Paul says, will be destroyed. But a person who does sin, but who believes in Christ and who receives his reward in salvation, goes to purification, that person will go to heaven. So you can continue sinning and lose that salvation that you have been gifted from God.
But
I know your Protestantism is coming out here.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not even a Protestant thing. It's a question of
what does the Bible teach?
What does the Bible teach, and
Yeah.
what is the ramifications of that? Because if we are saved by if we are saved by grace through faith, then if then also God's in a weird position where He could save us, but He decides not to. Like he gives us a gift. If we want to use
we have free will.
We do have free will.
So we reject Him willingly if we go to hell.
But
remember, I believe it's awfully hard to go to hell. That's my opinion. I believe you would have to willfully know that God exists and willfully reject Him. Now, I know there's some people who say, well, God exists, why would you willfully reject Him? Judas did it. It's definitely possible. So if you willfully reject God, I do believe that hell is, should be a reality for those kind of people that are really, really terrible individuals.
Well, we may be talking a question of degrees also, because
right, no doubt,
everyone is going to sin after becoming a Catholic or Christian. After accepting
Correct.
salvation, no one's perfect. They're going to continue to sin and work on that and struggle with their nature. That's a little bit different from someone being like, oh, great, I'm saved now. I'm going to go stealing and murdering and sinning and be unrepentant.
But that ideology that was Luther's ideology, though. So I know you're saying it might sound outlandish, but Luther said it himself. He said, you can sin and sin all you want because you've already been saved by Christ, by the blood of Christ. But that wasn't the teaching of the ancient church. If we look at what the earliest fathers believed on the whole chain leading up to Luther, none of them believed that kind of theology. So they did believe in purgatory. By the way, purgatory is very, very ancient. We can find it in the Bible and then in the earliest era of the church.
It's interesting. I mean, I have to look up that Luther quote. It seems like I have a hard time believing, maybe that's something he actually said, but I would have a hard time believing that if you got license like that from someone to be like, hey, enjoy yourself and do all the carousing you want because you're saved. I mean, that would be a super popular religion.
You got to look it up. It was very popular. I mean, sola fide, think of the whole ground. One of the foundations of it was you are going to be justified, saved by faith alone. That is a whole lot easier than believing and following a sacramental system. It took off. It became very popular.
Well, if I'm not,
in part also by the printing press, of course, but it became very popular.
If I'm not mistaken, Paul talks about in Galatians, he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. He talks about, maybe he says in Galatians, but he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. He says you will know them by their works or something along those lines. So I think the case would be made that, hey, if someone calls themselves a believer, one of the faithful, but continues to live a very libertine lifestyle, that they were never saved to begin with. And here's the fun part: you have popes that lived very libertine lifestyles, despite being the primacy of the faith and having that kind of position. So, do you think it's possible that there are popes who are masquerading as Christians and may not wind up being so?
You know what? I really don't know if there have been popes that have really not been believers. I mean, I've looked at it. Even the really political, even the really bad ones, even Boniface. From what I gathered, they were believers. They really were. They were just quite rotten. Some of them, not all. The massive majority of them have been great believers. And I see somebody made a comment. The fruits of the church are awful. I mean, the Catholic Church has done a ton of charity work throughout the world. They've done an amazing amount of work in the world. But what you see in the media is the rotten stuff. You see stories of pedophile priests. You see horrible stuff that has happened. It is a reality that I never ever dodge it. As an apologist, I should be able to say, guess what? We have a lot of really bad priests, but we have a massive majority are really, really good. I know a lot of really good ones, and I have had personal experiences with some really bad ones. I've lost speaking jobs at churches because I've had issues with certain priests. So I can tell you the fruits are definitely not bad. You know, we've got a lot of wolves in the church, but there are also a lot of really, really good people that have done a lot of really good charitable work. I mean, Mother Teresa is one example who was, in my life, in my eyes, an absolute saint even before she was declared one.
Well, once again, so many directions we could go with this. I definitely wouldn't put myself forward. I may be disagreeing with even some people on our channel about this. I mean, I respect that the Catholic Church has done a lot of, like I said, that they're not a 100% force for evil, like I think a lot of atheists would paint them as.
They've done a lot for science.
They do positive stuff, and they've done positive science stuff. They've done negative science stuff. They've also,
well, in the Middle Ages. I mean,
in the Middle Ages, but
look at where it was coming from, though. I mean, in the Middle Ages. I mean, there was a lot of rough stuff going on at the time period. You know, you've got the Crusades happening. You've got some battling against Islam. So you had a lot of tough stuff happening back then. So I'm not by any means excusing some of the stuff that happened back then, but none of it was ever church sanctioned. The selling of indulgences that happened in the period of Luther, even that was done by rogue individuals, never ever sanctioned by the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all I meant to say was that, you know, I think it's important to be not. Catholic Church is large and it's been around for a while, and there's been good stuff. There's definite problems, very high profile problems, as you mentioned.
No doubt.
And I hope that the church we would see them resolve some of these things. I have no problem with the church as far as the good work they do, their humanitarian efforts. They just do other stuff I disagree with also. So I'm not gonna say they're 100% good. They're not 100% evil. I will give them credit for the good they do, and hope that there are forces within the church to reform them and get rid of the excessively negative parts. And time will tell if that happens. But
I think it will. I think that Benedict began the process of really trying to weed out a lot of those bad guys. I think Francis is doing the same. And really, being an individual who I work within the church as well, aside from also being an apologist, I can tell you the church has really ramped up their background checks, their vetting of not just people that work within the church, but priests. And they should have done it a long time ago. Mm-hmm. But they're really trying to do a very good job now, and they've ramped up the efforts to do a very good job. And I really hope that they continue it. And I think they're on the right path. In terms of in the inner church, in the USA at least, I can tell you, and in Europe as well. I travel over there often. I give talks internationally speaking. So I can tell you, I think the efforts being done are very, very commendable.
Yeah, and hopefully that will continue. Okay, well, we've been at this for about 2 hours, and I think it was probably a good time to start winding things down. William, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed having you on. Is there a place, I know you do a lot of speaking and debating and stuff, is there a place where people can go to find out more about what you have going on?
No doubt. Right now, my website is down because I am uploading tons of MP3 debates to where you don't have to click a link and go to another page and download it, but you can right-click and download it. It should be back up tonight or tomorrow. It is www.patristicpillars.com. There, I provide a lot of original translations from Greek texts that don't exist in English, where I have translated them, some Latin ones as well that the people that I know have done, and just a ton of stuff there, free links to talks, debates, and what have you, and a lot of talks with atheists. I've done 2 Bible Geek shows with Bob Price. Mm-hmm. So I'm also very friendly with the atheist community. Welcome any criticism, any talks, anything, any questions, anything, you can find me there.
Excellent, excellent. And for myself personally, in addition to Atheist Edge, I blog at sleepinginsundays.com. I am on Twitter sometimes at Sleep Sundays, or you can see me on Atheist Edge. Just shoot my mouth off a whole lot. So, William Albrecht, thank you for your time, and we'll hope to get to talk to you again real soon.